Chapter 9. Joe hurried down the steps and jogged over to join up with the mustering bucks of Half Wind. He found Nate and the bracers. He stepped into the last slot just as Captain Fry appeared at the head of the company. Joe stood near the middle of the 50 or so soldiers who had been selected for this mission. Each buck stood a comfortable distance away from the next.
"Soldiers, we are officially here as Lord Ramnor's escort," Fry began. "But we all know that other kinds of trouble may await us. There are traitors here. We know who they are. They know who they are. So we must be vigilant. You have had your rest. Now we must work." He signaled to Lieutenant Drand, who hurried to the front of the muster. "Lieutenant Drand will lead you through drill, but I will be watching. Do not put our citadel to shame. Let us show what we are capable of." He pounded his chest 3 times, and the entire company followed suit. Then a rhythmic drumming began in the core of the company, and Joe joined in, slapping his thigh in time with the thrilling, thrumming sound. Lieutenant Drand smiled, then shouted, "Attack positions!" The company burst into action, letting out a fierce cry as they crouched in readiness. "Advance and draw!" he called. The company surged ahead, each buck retrieving his sword and holding it ready. "Battle forms!" Joe joined the others, all swinging their swords in energetic but careful maneuvers, keeping their distance from one another. "Hold and thunder!" Drand ordered. The company stopped moving forward, but kept their feet churning in deliberate steps, crouching in a rapid stamp that seemed to shake the ground. Joe's legs hurt, but he had done this often, and he knew he had it in him to continue. He wouldn't let Nate down. The rhythmic rumble stretched on in a swelling anticipation. "Strike on me!" Drand cried at last, louder than ever, in an urgent order that the eager bucks obeyed with fervor. They swarmed their commander, swords poised and cries ringing out, in a blistering attack that collapsed the space between soldiers. Joe, anticipating the order, pressed ahead and brought his sword point near Drand's neck, in time with only a few others. They froze there, weapons aimed and holding steady, until Drand, who had not moved, nodded approvingly and called out, "Turn and rally!" Each rabbit drew back and twisted, rushing back to his original mark and line. When they were all set, Lieutenant Drand glanced over at Captain Fry. The old buck nodded. "Partner and clash!" Drand called, and he walked over to speak to Captain Fry while the soldiers paired up. Joe and Owen partnered and began going through sword forms together, working hard and challenging each other intensely. "You're good with the blade," Owen said, surprised. "I mean, you're by far the worst in the braces, but still not as terrible as I would have thought." "Thank you," Joe smirked. Owen nodded, smiling mischievously. They kept working for the next half hour, Joe feeling more and more at home among the bucks of Nate's band. "How long have you been with Nate's archers?" Joe asked, as they took a moment to catch their breath. 6 months or so," Owen answered. "Is he always as focused and, I don't know." Joe searched for the word. "Perfect?" "Nate's all he seems," Owen said. "But he has chinks in his armor, just like everyone else. A few months back, he almost left Half Wind." "I never heard about that. Why?" "He lets the pressure build and build. He takes too much on himself. He acts like the pressure doesn't matter. He ignores it. Then it comes back and attacks him all at once. It was pretty bad." Joe felt a twinge of guilt. He had always thought of Nate as nearly invincible, and had envied him for it. He shook his head. "What is it?" Owen asked. "I can't believe how unfair I've been to Nate," Joe said. Owen nodded, and seemed impressed by Joe's contrition. "Yeah, of all the rabbits to be angry at, Nate shouldn't be high on anyone's list." Just then Joe saw a gray rabbit emerge from the cave passage ahead and gaze over the plateau, as if he were looking for someone. Joe squinted, then pointed, eyes going wide. "Is that Wilfred Longtreader?" he asked, a knot of anger twisting in his stomach. He knew what the older rabbit looked like from drawings and descriptions. "I think it must be," Owen said. He looked on in disgust as Wilfred stood in front of the caves. The loud clang of clashing swords died down as a murmur swelled among the Half-Wind company. Joe saw Captain Fry break off his conversation with Drand to angrily ask why none of his soldiers were working. Before anyone else could speak, his gaze fell on Wilfred. His eyes bulged and his mouth bent in a fierce frown. He marched toward Wilfred. Joe stepped forward, eager to see and hear what would pass.
but he had no need to fear not hearing. The whole plateau had gone quiet. Wilfrid was looking past Fry, toward the standing stones, then back over the half-wind soldiers.
Come to spy out our military readiness, have you, long-treader scum?
Fry asked, coming almost nose to nose with Wilfrid. The gray buck didn't blanch.
"They have been well cared for, Captain,"
Wilfrid said, glancing over the half-wind bucks.
"If only your breath had been so diligently addressed," he finished,
waving the air between himself and Fry.
"You mock me?"
Fry asked in almost a snarl. Joe saw that Wilfrid was calm, carefully attending to his surroundings, while Captain Fry was near frothing.
"I do, but you do far worse to me, without even accounting for the foul breath. Mockery is far less severe than slander,"
Wilfrid said.
"Slander?"
Fry fumed.
"Do you deny that Long-Treaders betrayed the king to Morb and Blackhawk?"
"Long-Treader,"
Wilfrid said, his own anger rising.
"Singular. One Long-Treader. First name, Garton."
"Do you deny that you answered to your brother Garton?"
"I do not. I was his right hand."
"And yet you persist in this fantasy that we're supposed to believe you knew nothing of the imminent betrayal?"
Wilfrid's head fell, and he rubbed at his eyes. He looked very tired. Joe nodded, and murmuring began again among the half-wind soldiers. Joe felt as though Captain Fry's fury spoke for every common buck who hated the name Longtreader and wanted them confronted with their treachery. After a moment, Wilfrid spoke again.
"I am ashamed. I did not see it coming,"
he said, his anger subsiding, and his voice much softer.
"It's a shame that I strive every day to erase."
"You can't pretend your family is anything other than a cadre of traitors,"
Fry said coldly.
"And every last one of you deserves justice."
"Does Lord Ramner know that you threaten me?"
Wilfrid asked.
"And that you threaten my young niece and nephew? How many children need to be killed to satisfy your slanderous bloodlust?"
"They aren't really children,"
Fry said, his voice growing louder again.
"We want justice, and if the Lords can't bring it, then we will."
"You're insane, Fry,"
Wilfrid said.
"And I wish you'd see reason and join the actual cause of Jupiter's heir and the mended wood."
"You don't get to lecture me,"
Fry shouted.
"I bled for this cause, and I'll die for it. I'd give my life in a moment if it meant advancing this cause, even if that meant going outside the law to deal with you."
Joe found himself grunting his agreement with the watching soldiers as they not so silently urged their captain on.
"You sadden me deeply, Fry," Wilfrid said. "I want you to aim your weapons at Morbin and Red-Eye Garlickson once more."
"I am,"
Fry said. Then he raised his arm and turned to his soldiers. After a moment's pause, he cried out,
"Strike on me!"
Joe and the rest of the half-wind soldiers gave a shout and charged toward Wilfrid. Captain Fry tore free his sword and, along with 50 furious bucks, leveled it at Wilfrid's neck. Joe's own blade was stretched out, and his face set in an angry snarl.
"What do you say now, traitor Longtreader?"
Fry asked, seething with rage. Wilfrid had a sword at his side, and Joe could tell by his motions that he knew how to handle himself. Yet the sword stayed in its sheath. Probably smart. If he dared draw on Fry, he would be cut to pieces in a moment. Then Joe heard another voice, a strong, calm tone that sounded familiar.
"Wilfrid, sir," Joe heard, "you'll be late for the meeting with the Citadel Lords. I know they're expecting you at their session. Let's go." Then Joe saw him, the white rabbit from the 7th standing stone. Smalls took Wilfrid's arm, and, though Wilfrid was reluctant to step away, as good as forced him to turn and head back into the cave. They disappeared as the sun set.
Chapter 10. The next days passed quickly, but the tension in Cloud Mountain only rose. Rumor had it that Captain Fry had been reprimanded and warned by the Congress, in a narrow vote, not to harass Wilfrid Longtreader. Others said that the incident hadn't even been reported. Still, most of the half-wind soldiers and their friends from Blackstone Citadel seemed certain that the trial of Wilfrid Longtreader would be announced at any moment. Joe joined the other soldiers in congratulating Captain Fry for standing up to the traitor. At lunch one day, Joe saluted the surly captain. You were right to do it, sir, Joe said. Thank you for saying what none of us can.
Stay alert, soldier,
Fry said, nodding to Joe with a neutral expression.
Storm's coming. Be ready.
That night the storm did come, rolling in just as Joe and the bracers followed Captain Fry and Pacer out of the savory den and into the long cave tunnel. They emerged into the night as the rain started, with thunder booming. A pulsing flash lit up the purple clouds hanging low overhead. Joe felt like the storm was right on top of them. He shivered, and not from cold. Once beyond the cave and into the woods, Pacer led them down the mountain and toward a tower hide. The tower hide was a secret fort built for observation. Joe climbed the rope ladder and went through the hole cut in the wood that surrounded the high, large, but well-concealed tower hide in the forest. Thankfully, a sturdy roof kept off the rain.
Captain Fry, if you please. The bracers will observe from here,
Pacer said, motioning to Nate.
I'll take my bucks into the woods for our perimeter checks. I'll see you at the rendezvous. Thank you, Lieutenant Pacer, Fry said. Keep a sharp eye out, lads. Captain Braun of Blackstone says they've had wolf sightings the past few nights. Lieutenant Flynn, carry on.
Nate saluted his commander and gathered the bracers.
Studge, Junder, Owen, and Shanks, you're on first watch, Nate said. The rest will sleep until midnight.
They nodded, and Nate assigned Joe and each of the other first watchers to one of the 4 sides of the fort. From his perch, Joe had a clear view of several open areas of the mountainside forest. He could see, by squinting in the occasional flashes of light, the wider, open lands toward the bottom of the mountain. The tower hide was part way down the mountain, below the usual fog. But in this rumbling storm, there was no wispy wall of mist, only a bank of clouds so heavy and threatening that Joe cringed at its closeness. Right now the clouds seemed to be just overhead, and their thundering rumble rattled his bones. The lightning, which had so far lit up only the angry clouds above, now sent a searing spike to earth, crackling down to shatter a tree close to the fort. Joe shot up and stumbled back. His heart was racing, but he peered out into the night. He had seen something in the sudden light. Keeping his eyes on the spot, he waited until the next flash illuminated the clearing. There! He saw 3 rabbits. It was Pacer's team. There were 2 bucks with the lieutenant, and Joe relaxed as the storm went on. Still, Joe kept an eye out, especially in that clearing, to see if Pacer's team was being followed. Captain Fry rounded the corner, hands behind his back, as he examined Joe's position and the surrounding scene.
You all right, soldier? He asked.
Yes, sir, Joe said. But I saw something there. He pointed to the clearing. It was Lieutenant Pacer's team, sir.
Very good, Fry began. Like I said, we have to—
Wait, Joe said, cutting him off. Look, he whispered. Captain Fry turned to see what Joe had seen. A lone rabbit, visible in the frequent flashes of lightning, was crouched near the edge of the clearing where Pacer's team had just passed. He looked nervously back and forth, even peering toward the fort, where 2 sets of eager eyes gazed down on him.
Can you make out who he is?
Captain Fry asked in his gruff tone.
My eyes aren't as young as they once were.
I see him pretty clearly, sir, Joe said, but I don't recognize him.
Color?
Gray or gold, sir, Joe said. Maybe both. It's hard to see color well, especially in this rain.
Well,
Captain Fry said, whistling softly,
that's very interesting. Let's get down there and see what's afoot.
Joe saluted, and they quickly found Nate.
Lieutenant Flynn, leave 4 bucks here, Fry said. The rest, including you, with me. Now.
Yes, sir, Nate said, hurrying to leave orders with the restless bucks. Captain Fry was already making his difficult way down the ladder, followed by Joe, Junder, and Nate. Reaching the wet forest floor, they followed Captain Fry down the mountainside, toward the clearing where they had seen the gray and gold-furred rabbit. Captain Fry was out of breath by the time they came to the clearing, and they slowed to approach the spot with caution. Joe had his bow out as he scanned the darkness for any sign of movement. When they reached the spot, Fry raised his hand in a signal to wait and pointed to his ears. Joe listened carefully over the pattering rain, continuing to scan the clearing and the surrounding trees. An agonizing minute passed before they heard a rustling across the clearing. Captain Fry signaled them to stay down, then peered out into the night. Then Joe heard a very familiar sound, the thwick and whish of an arrow fired. Nate Flynn darted out a hand, undercutting Captain Fry's feet as the arrows sped overhead and the old captain tumbled down. Joe got to his knees as he and Junder quickly knocked and fired a return volley, sending several shots into the darkness from which their attackers had fired. Junder got to his feet and darted right, firing as he moved wider. They were trained for this. To make a target harder to hit, you split up to widen your force. Joe sprang up and headed left. After a few steps, he leapt from a rock, firing in midair as the sky crackled and split with a twisting dart of lightning. Landing, he rolled over and took cover behind a tree. A quiet moment passed in which Joe could hear his heartbeat, Captain Fry's wheeze, and the steady sound of the slowly weakening rain. Then they came. Wolves broke into the clearing. Chapter 11. 3 of the massive creatures surged toward them across the clearing. Their attack was covered by arrows shot from at least one more wolf in hiding. "Run!" Captain Fry called, and the 3 younger rabbits quickly obeyed. There was no shame in a strategic retreat when the odds were this bad. Joe risked a last shot into the forest, but he turned to flee before he could see if it had helped stifle the lupine archer in the darkness. It was a mad scramble back up the mountain, and he had never run so fast, nor ever had he felt so powerless to escape. The wolves were too big and too fast to just dart away from easily, and he kept slipping on the wet, muddy ground.
"Split up and get to the fort,"
Captain Fry called, making a sideways leap into a thicket. Nate and Junder broke the other way, running in a wild panic. Joe saw that Junder had lost his bow, and that Nate had no space to get a shot off. If he turned, the wolves would be on him. Joe dove into the thicket behind Captain Fry and rolled through a thorny tangle of brush before finding his feet again in a desperate, terrified rush. He ran and ran, twisting through the forest, madly zigzagging back toward the fort. He couldn't find Captain Fry, but he ran on and on until his breath came in short, painful gasps. When he could run full out no more, he risked a backward glance. Nothing. Joe had been fortunate. The wolves had not found him, and he was, for now, out of immediate danger. He considered remaining where he was, trying to stay safe, but his orders were to return to the fort, so he moved on, doing his best to locate anything recognizable to guide him back that way. He ran as quietly as he could, ears attentive for any noise. The rain had stopped, and the clouds were breaking up. A full moon appeared, and the forest suddenly became much clearer. Joe began to run faster as he sensed he was getting nearer the fort. Seeing a familiar marker in a rotting tree, he broke through an opening and into a small clearing. What he saw there filled him with terror. A wolf, jaws open, on top of Junder. Junder wasn't moving, and the wolf was poised to destroy him. A cloud passed in front of the moon, dimming what light there had been. Joe unslung his bow and reached for his quiver. One arrow. Was Junder alive? The wolf bore down on the young rabbit just as another wolf appeared, and Captain Fry came bursting into the clearing. The scene was chaotic, and Joe felt his heart racing. He raised the bow and nocked his only arrow. He aimed. That wolf's so close to Junder! Joe was afraid he'd hit his ally. How could he live with himself if he killed a fellow soldier instead of saving him? He aimed, trying to ignore the other wolf in the clearing, the presence of Captain Fry, and the endless list of horrible things that could happen if he failed. He waited, breath in, breath out, and waited. "Shoot!" Captain Fry called, rushing the other wolf in Joe's periphery. Joe took a breath, another breath. The second wolf slammed into him and sent him sprawling in the mud as everything went black. Chapter 12. Joe woke up in Cloud Mountain, his head aching. He was in the hospital, and an auburn doe with white spots was leaning over him. "What's happening?" "You're fine," the red doe said. "You had a rough time and you're resting, but you're okay." "What happened to me?" Joe asked. His memories were muddled. "You were knocked unconscious in the forest last night," the doe said. "You were on patrol." Joe's memory of the night before came back in startling scenes. His first glimpse of combat, lit up by lightning and the rain, and ending in the moment he failed to fire when the wolf was on top of Junder. He began to squirm, his breathing coming faster and more shallow. His heart was racing. Calm down, soldier, the doe said, taking his hand and placing her other hand calmly on his chest. You need to breathe deeply right now. Chunder, I didn't shoot, Joe almost shouted. Listen to me, the doe said firmly, tightening her grip on Joe's hand. You listen to me, soldier. Right now I'm your commander, and I'm telling you to take a deep breath. The authority in her tone got his attention, and he turned to look in her eyes. I didn't shoot, he whispered breathlessly. I was afraid I'd... Take a deep breath now, she insisted. Joe obeyed, breathing in deeply. Another? She asked, her eyes locked on Joe's and demanding his attention. That's better, she said, as he took more deep breaths in turn. Keep that up, please. Now, what's your name? I'm Joe, he answered, his heartbeat slowing a bit as he listened and followed her instructions. Joe Shanks. I'm Emma, Joe. It's nice to meet you. Now, Emma went on, you're in the hospital, and you're going to be fine. You got a knock from the attack, but you're okay. We don't have to rush anything, soldier. You're not missing anything. Then why are there so few here? Joe asked, looking around the sparsely occupied room. Good question, Emma said, grimacing. So, earlier, a few seconds ago, in fact, when I said that you aren't missing anything, that wasn't accurate. You're missing a huge thing. Oh, so, about you saying that I'm okay, is that true? Mostly, she said, taking her hand off his chest. What are we missing? He asked. It's a big meeting of, well, everyone, Emma said, letting go of Joe's hand and digging into her satchel. They're going to try to fix all the heated division, the angry infighting, and the irreconcilable discord with, if I'm not mistaken, a concert and some good speeches. She rolled her eyes. That ought to do it, he said, smiling. That's what I think, too, Emma replied with exaggerated agreement. I mean, if a concert can't heal long-standing political and interpersonal strife, then what can? And if you add in the speeches, Joe said. Yes, I had almost forgotten about the speeches, Emma replied, filling a bottle with a foul-smelling ointment. With the speeches added to the music, I'd say we should expect Morbin's surrender by morning. At the latest, Joe agreed. Emma couldn't help it. She laughed, spilling some of the ointment on her sleeve. Brilliant! Now my sleeve will smell like dung nettle all day. At least you'll be able to wake up unconscious rabbits with only a wave of your wrist, Joe said, wiping at his nose. True, she replied, smiling down on him as she returned the bottle to her satchel. Now, how are you feeling? She put her hand over his heart again. A little better. Keep breathing deeply and try to relax, Emma said. He nodded, getting in several deep breaths before speaking again. My friends, Chunder and Nate Flynn, what happened? There were a few casualties in the fight out on the perimeter last night, she said. Chunder, he was hurt pretty badly. He lived? Joe gasped. He had been so afraid that his indecision had cost Chunder his life. How is he? It will be a while before he can walk, she said, looking down sadly. And he'll never shoot a bow again. It's not your fault, came the words from a buck nearby. Nate Flynn walked up from behind Joe's bed. You weren't sure of the shot, Joe, so you didn't take it. That was wise. I froze, Joe said, looking down, then away, anywhere but at Nate or Emma. So Chunder lost an arm, Nate said. He's got another one. He'll probably still be better with a sword than you are. I'm sorry, Nate, Joe said, looking up at him with shining eyes. I should have shot. The shot was taken, an imperfect shot at that, and the wolf ran off. We got you and Chunder back here, and that's all well. Far better than it could have been. Who took the shot? Joe asked. He already knew. That's not important. What's important is getting you healthy again. I'm fine, Joe said, according to this fine Dr. Emma, who has a reputation for honesty and for smelling good. Emma smirked. I'm not a doctor, and he can't go anywhere yet, she said. Dr. Zyger has to release him, and he still needs care. I thought you said I was fine. I want you to talk to a friend of mine, and I'll take you to meet her tomorrow. Her name is Maggie Osage. I've heard about her, Joe said, frowning. Isn't she the crazy old lady who sits on a porch and stares out into the mist? Yes, Emma said. I want you to talk to her. I need to go back on duty, Joe said, throwing off the covers and swinging his long legs out of the bed. The war's coming."
"You'll follow orders, Joe," Nate said, stepping over and forcing him back onto the bed. "Right now you're under care, and if you have to see Magnat O'Grave or Dr. Ziegler or whoever else they want you to see, you'll do it. That's an order." Joe frowned. "Thank you, Officer Bucksteady, or whatever your name is," Emma said, nodding to Nate.
"Joe," she said, turning back to her patient, "I'll be back in a bit. Don't go anywhere," she said, winking at him before walking away, "or you'll get in army trouble from that buck there who tells you what to do. When I get out of this hospital, I'm going to make sure I never have to come back to one ever again," Joe grumbled.
"Good luck with that during the war," Nate said.
"I'll come and check on you tomorrow, Joe. Keep your head up, Buck." "Yes, sir," Joe said, saluting as Nate walked off. Then he finished under his breath, "Anything you say, Bucksteady." He sat in lonely silence, frustrated at not being able to get back to the bracers, even though he felt fine. Fine, other than the headache, and it was an intense one. He rolled over in his bed and closed his eyes. He tried to relax, but the image of a wolf in the woods and himself frozen, unable to take a shot, haunted his waking dreams. He tried to distract himself by thinking of his encounter with Emma. She was a lovely doe, and what a wit! Was it possible she really didn't know who Nate Flynn was? Or was she just being funny? What would it take to be so illustrious that you were known all over Natalia? He opened his eyes and looked for Emma, but she wasn't there. He closed them again and saw a vision of the wolf in the woods, looking up at him with bloody jaws. He willed the image away, and it was replaced in his mind by one of his father, old, withered, and bitter.
"You must make a name for yourself, son," he had said more than once. "You must strive and strive and strive until honor surrounds you and glory descends on you like a crown. They will give you nothing. You must take it, no matter the cost."
But here he was, in a hospital, with no real injuries, having missed his first true shot at mild glory. As rabbits filed back into the hospital, he pulled the blanket over his head and wept. He kept on weeping till he slept. Joe was awakened not long after by screams. Urgent cries echoed around the now frantic hospital.
"Wolf attack!"
shouted the terrified rabbits.
"Wolves inside Cloud Mountain!